The first gunshot shattered the champagne flute in my hand. I didn't even have time to register the sound before the yacht lurched violently to port, sending crystal and sparkling wine cascading across the marble deck. My knees connected with the hardwood, pain shooting up my thighs, and then the smoke hit, thick, acrid, burning my throat in ways that shouldn't have been possible for someone like me. Someone who'd been dead for 7 years. Another round tore through the railing above my head, splintering teak and sending shards raining down on my shoulders. I pressed myself flat against the deck, hard hammering in a chest that technically didn't need to beat anymore, but my body remembered. It always remembered. Everything smelled like gunpowder and fear and blood. Not mine. Not yet. Get down. A hand closed around my wrist, yanking me backward with brutal efficiency. I knew that grip. I'd memorized it over 3 years of watching from the shadows, cataloging every detail of the women who ruled my existence. Cold. Unshakable. Precisely measured. Vivienne Moreau, one half of the twin vampire dynasty that had swallowed my family's empire whole, that had turned me into something I'd never asked to be, that had stolen my mortality and my future and everything I'd ever known. She dragged me behind a steel column just as another hail of bullets tore through the space where I'd been kneeling. My ears rang. My vision blurred at the edges, the familiar darkening that came with hunger I'd been ignoring for days. Vivienne didn't flinch. She pulled a pistol from the holster beneath her blazer like it was a phone, aimed into the darkness beyond the deck railing, and fired 3 perfect shots. 3 bodies hit the water in rapid succession, the splashes barely audible over the chaos. Move. Her voice was flat. Empty. The same tone she used when ordering her morning blood, or signing territory acquisition documents, or condemning rivals to final death. I couldn't. My legs wouldn't listen. Every muscle in my body had locked up, frozen in that primal terror that no amount of vampiric strength could override. I was a predator by species, but in this moment, I was prey. Just like I'd always been. Now, Genevieve. Hearing my name from her mouth felt wrong. She never said it. I was the assistant or, on her worst days, the liability. Never Genevieve. Not once in 3 years of indentured servitude, not since the night she'd turned me against my will and claimed me as her debt. But the way she said it now, sharp, urgent, edged with something that might have been concern, made my legs stumble forward on shaking knees. Gunfire erupted again, this time from our side. Across the deck, Vivienne's twin sister Celeste moved like a shadow made flesh. Silent. Lethal. She didn't waste bullets. Every shot she fired found its mark with surgical precision. 3 rounds. 3 lives. I knew the details because I'd filed the reports. I'd cataloged the aftermath. I'd watched them both walk through blood and carnage without breaking stride, without blinking, without anything that resembled human emotion. And I hated them. I hated the way they looked at me like I was furniture. I hated their cold voices and blood-stained empire and the way they'd made me complicit in horrors I couldn't even name. I hated that I needed their protection to survive, that the life they'd forced on me had made me dependent on them in ways I'd never wanted to be. I hated that I'd had to watch my father's business crumble, my family's legacy become nothing more than another acquisition in the Moreau twins' endless expansion. I hated that they'd turned me to save a contract, not because they cared, not because I mattered, but because I was useful. A bargaining chip. A piece on their chessboard. I hated that right now, in this moment of absolute terror, they were the only reason I wasn't dead. Lifeboat. Now. Celeste appeared beside us, reloading without looking, her face unreadable as always. Her silver hair was streaked with something darker, blood, I realized, but not hers. The bullets hitting her had already healed, flesh knitting back together before the wounds could properly form. The same impossible regeneration that made them invincible. That she'd denied me. Vivian grabbed my arm again, hauling me toward the yacht's edge. The lifeboat swung wildly on its cables, waves crashing against the hull below. 50 feet of open water, freezing, churning, waiting to swallow us whole. My stomach turned. I can't. You will. She shoved me forward. I grabbed the railing just as another explosion rocked the yacht from bow to stern. Fire bloomed behind us, orange and furious, heat licking at my back with terrifying intimacy. I didn't think. I couldn't think. I jumped. The impact knocked every molecule of air from my lungs. I hit the lifeboat hard, pain shooting up my spine, and then Vivian landed beside me a second later, already reaching for the release mechanism. Celeste dropped in last, gun still raised, scanning the burning deck above with cold precision. The cables snapped. We plummeted. Water swallowed us whole. When we surfaced, the yacht was a funeral pyre against the night sky, flames reaching toward heaven like desperate hands. Vivian grabbed the oars and started rowing, muscles straining against the current. Celeste kept her weapon trained on the wreckage, watching for threats that might emerge from the inferno. I just sat there, shaking so hard my teeth chattered despite the cold that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with terror. We were alive. Somehow, impossibly, we were alive. Keep your head down, Celeste said. Not to me. Never to me. But I ducked anyway. The yacht groaned, metal twisting, and something inside it exploded. Debris rained down around us, shrapnel sizzling as it hit the water. Vivian rowed harder, her jaw tight, her hands steady. I wondered if anything ever made her shake. If anything in her centuries of existence had ever truly frightened her. We're clear, Celeste said quietly. She lowered the gun. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. That's when the final shot rang out. It came from nowhere. From everywhere. A sharp crack that split the air and the silence and everything in between. Vivian moved before I even processed the sound. She threw herself across me, slamming me down into the bottom of the boat, her body covering mine completely. I felt the impact before I understood it, a wet, heavy thud against her back. She gasped. Not a scream. Not a cry. Just a small, broken sound that didn't belong to someone like her. Vivian. Celeste's voice cracked. I'd never heard it crack before. Vivian slumped. Her weight pressed me into the wooden boards, and warm liquid spread across my chest. I knew what it was before I looked. Blood. So much blood. Dark, viscous, thick with something ancient and powerful. No. No, no, no. Celeste was already moving, pulling her sister off me, laying her flat across the lifeboat's bench. Her hands that had killed without hesitation for centuries, trembled as they pressed against the wound in Vivian's back. Blood poured between her fingers, black and terrible in the moonlight. Vivian's eyes were open but unfocused. Her breathing came in shallow, rattling gasps that didn't belong to someone who should have healed instantly. Someone who should have been invincible. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. Fragile. Human. Mortal. Stay with me. Celeste's voice broke completely. Don't you dare leave me. Don't you dare. I couldn't move. Couldn't think. My hands were covered in Vivian's blood, my shirt soaked with it, my entire world reduced to this one impossible moment. This wasn't supposed to happen. People like Vivian didn't bleed. Didn't fall. didn't die. But she was dying. I could see it in the way her chest barely rose. In the way her lips turned pale. In the way Celeste's hands shook harder with every passing second. "Help me!" Celeste screamed at me. I flinched. My body finally obeyed. I crawled forward, pressing my hands where Celeste's had been. The blood was warm. Too warm. It wouldn't stop. "Breathe," I whispered to Vivian, to myself, to anyone who would listen. "Please breathe." Vivian's eyes found mine for 1 second. Just one. I saw something I'd never seen before. Fear. Not for herself. Something else. Something that looked almost like regret. Then her eyes closed. "No." Celeste grabbed her sister's face. "Open your eyes. Look at me. Look at me." Nothing. Celeste started compressions. Hard. Desperate. Her perfect control shattered into raw animal panic. She counted under her breath, 30 compressions, 2 breaths, 30 more. Blood still poured. The wound wouldn't close. The regeneration that should have saved her had failed. She took a round to the heart, Celeste choked out. "Silver. It's silver. The poison is spreading. Why isn't she healing?" My voice was hysterical, high, and broken. "She's a pureblood, she should. The bullet's still inside her. The silver is killing her from within. If I can't get it out." Celeste's hand shot out, grabbing my throat. Her grip was iron, her eyes wild with grief and rage. Tears streaked her face, but her voice was deadly calm. "If anything happens to my sister, I will end you. I will tear you apart molecule by molecule and scatter your ashes across every ocean on this planet. Do you understand me?" I couldn't breathe. Couldn't speak. Her fingers tightened, claws extending just slightly, pressing into my skin with promise of violence. "Do you understand, Genevieve?" I nodded. Barely. Her fingers were crushing my windpipe. And then Vivian gasped. A wet, rattling sound that didn't belong in a human throat. But it was breath. Life. Celeste's hand vanished from my neck. She lunged for her sister, pulling Vivian against her chest with a desperation that made my own chest ache. Her arms wrapped around Vivian like she could hold her together through will alone. "I'm here. I'm here." Celeste's voice cracked into something unrecognizable. Soft. Broken. Human. She whispered something in French, words I didn't understand but understood the tone. The sound of someone begging. Vivian's eyes fluttered. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Blood still seeped through Celeste's fingers, slower now but still there. I should have looked away. Given them privacy. But I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, because I'd never seen them like this. Not once in 3 years had I seen Celeste touch her sister with anything resembling gentleness. Not once had I heard that tone in her voice. They were ice. They were steel. They were the kind of people who condemned rivals to final death over breakfast and never blinked. But right now, Celeste looked like she was dying too. And something inside me shifted. I didn't stop hating them. I couldn't. Not after everything. But watching Celeste cradle her sister's bloodied body, tears streaking her face, it was impossible to see them as only monsters. Just women. Twins. Sisters who would burn the world for each other. Genevieve. Celeste's voice snapped back to command. She didn't look at me, her eyes stayed locked on Vivian. Search the boat. Find anything useful. I moved before I could think. My hands were still shaking, still covered in Vivian's blood. The lifeboat was small, standard emergency supplies lining the compartments beneath the seats. Flares. A first aid kit. Bottled water. Thermal blankets. A knife. First aid kit, I said, shoving it toward her. Celeste grabbed it with one hand, the other still pressed against Vivian's back. She tore it open with her teeth, spilling gauze and antiseptic across the bench. Scissors. Tweezers. My stomach turned. Row, Celeste ordered. Get us to shore. Now. I grabbed the oars. My arms screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. The water fought me, waves pushing us back, salt spray stinging my eyes. I pulled harder. Behind me, I heard Celeste moving. Fabric tearing. Vivian's shallow breathing. And then the scream. It ripped through the night like a blade, raw and guttural, pain stripped of everything human. I nearly dropped the oars. Keep rowing. Celeste's voice was sharp, controlled, but I heard the tremor underneath. I kept rowing. My hands blistered. My shoulders burned. But I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because Vivian was still screaming, and the sound clawed at something deep inside me. I'd heard people scream before, in that building, in those rooms I wasn't supposed to enter. But this was different. This was someone fighting to stay alive. Almost done. Celeste muttered. I didn't know if she was talking to Vivian or herself. I risked a glance over my shoulder. Celeste's hands were covered in blood. Vivian's shirt was shredded, exposing the wound. The bullet sat in Celeste's palm, small and dark and wrong. She dropped it into the bottom of the boat with a metallic clink. Vivian had gone silent. Too silent. Is she? She's breathing. Celeste's voice was flat again. Empty. She wrapped gauze around Vivian's torso with practiced efficiency. Tight. Secure. Her hands didn't shake anymore, but her jaw was clenched so hard I thought her teeth would crack. Vivian's eyes were half open, unfocused. Her skin was gray. I turned back to the water and rowed harder. The shore appeared through the darkness. A strip of sand, pale against the black water. Beyond it, trees. Thick. Endless. The kind of forest that swallowed people whole. My arms gave out the second the boat scraped against sand. I collapsed forward, gasping, every muscle in my body screaming. Celeste didn't wait. She was already moving, lifting Vivian like she weighed nothing, carrying her toward the beach. I forced myself to stand. My legs shook. The world tilted. But I followed, because what else could I do? The sand was cold under my feet, wet. The forest loomed ahead, black against the night sky. No lights. No buildings. No signs of civilization. Just trees and darkness and 3 women who shouldn't be alive. I pulled out my phone. No signal. Of course not. Celeste, my voice came out hoarse. There's no signal? I know. She laid Vivian down on the sand, checking her pulse. Her sister's chest rose and fell, barely. I looked at Vivian. Really looked at her. Her face was pale, too pale. Blood soaked through the bandages already. She needed a hospital. Surgery. Doctors. We had sand and trees. Vivian's eyes opened just barely. They found mine in the darkness. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Just shallow breaths that rattled in her chest. The reality of it hit me all at once. We were stranded. No signal. No rescue coming. She couldn't survive this, not without help, not without medicine, equipment, people who knew what they were doing. We were going to watch her die. Celeste stood abruptly. She wiped the blood from her hands onto her ruined pants, her face unreadable again. Cold. The cracks sealed over like they'd never existed. She bent down and lifted Vivian into her arms. Her sister's head lolled against her shoulder, blood dripping onto the sand. Celeste turned to me. Her eyes were ice, but her hands were still shaking. Move, she said. Her voice was quiet. Deadly. My legs barely held me, but I followed Celeste into the forest. We walked for what felt like hours. The trees closed in fast, thick and dark, branches clawing at my face and arms. I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, just Celeste's silhouette cutting through the shadows like she'd done this 1,000 times before. Maybe she had. A century of existence left plenty of time for survival training. There. Celeste's voice cut through the silence. I looked up. A cottage. Small. Weathered. Hidden so deep in the trees I would have walked right past it. Celeste didn't hesitate. She kicked the door open and disappeared inside. I followed, my heart pounding in my throat. The interior was dark but dry. Dust covered everything, but it was intact. Furniture. Shelves. A small bed in the corner. And supplies, blankets stacked on a chair, canned food on a shelf, a metal box on the table that looked like a first aid kit. Someone had lived here. Recently enough that the supplies weren't rotted. Celeste laid Vivian on the bed. Her sister's breathing was shallow but steady. She grabbed the first aid kit, tearing it open with the same cold efficiency she used for everything. I stood frozen in the doorway. Useless. Light, Celeste said without looking at me. Find a light. I searched. Found a battery-powered lantern on the shelf. Flicked it on. Weak yellow light flooded the room. Celeste was already cutting away Vivian's makeshift bandages. The wound looked worse in the light. Angry red. Still bleeding. But Celeste's hands didn't shake. She cleaned it. Disinfected it. Stitched the edges with thread from the kit, movements precise and practiced. I watched from the corner, hands clenched at my sides. Vivian didn't wake. Didn't scream. Just lay there, pale and still. When Celeste finally wrapped fresh bandages around her sister, she sat back. Her shoulders sagged, just for a second. Then she straightened, cold mask sliding back into place. She needs a hospital, Celeste said quietly. The wound could still get infected. The silver poison is still in her bloodstream. Even if the bullet's out, her system is compromised. I nodded. My throat was too tight to speak. Vivian's breathing evened out. Color returned to her lips, just a little. Enough to make my chest unclench. She was alive. For now. Celeste stood and walked to the window, staring out into the darkness. Her reflection stared back, hollow-eyed and blood-stained. The silence stretched between us. Heavy. Suffocating. I couldn't stand it anymore. I'm sorry. The words came out hoarse. Broken. Celeste didn't turn. For what? I gestured uselessly. All of this. The attack. Vivian getting shot. If I hadn't been there. You weren't at fault. I blinked. Stared at her back. That wasn't what I expected. Not from her. Not from the woman who'd threatened to make me pay less than an hour ago. Celeste finally turned. Her face was calm, too calm, but there was something different in her eyes. Something that looked almost like exhaustion. The people who attacked us, she said slowly. They weren't after you. They were after us. You were collateral. Wrong place, wrong time. I opened my mouth. Closed it. I didn't know what to say. This wasn't the Ice Queen I knew, the woman who snapped orders and never explained herself, who treated me like furniture. This was someone else. Someone tired. The council, Celeste continued. Her voice was soft, dangerous. They've wanted to dismantle our house for decades. We represent everything they fear, women who built an empire without male oversight, who proved we didn't need their ancient bloodlines or their archaic traditions. We flourished. And that made us a target. I stared at her. The council. They're the ones who attacked us? They've been looking for an excuse. Any excuse. A weak point they could exploit. Her eyes found mine. You were never a weak point, Genevieve. You were leverage. Something they thought they could use against us. The words settled into my chest like stones. When we get back, Celeste said, her voice going cold again, sharp as a blade, I will make them pay for this. Every single one of them. I believed her. Celeste moved to the table, scanning the room. We need to figure out where we are. Find a way to signal for help. She started searching, opened drawers, checked shelves, found old books and maps and handwritten notes. I joined her. We worked in silence, sorting through everything, trying to piece together where this cottage was and who'd lived here. The maps were old, hand-drawn, no labels, but there were markings. Paths, water sources. Whoever lived here knew the area, Celeste muttered. She traced a line on the map. This could be useful. I watched her work. Really watched her. Her hands moved with precision, her eyes scanned every detail. She didn't miss anything. Didn't panic. Just analyzed, planned, adapted. She was brilliant. I'd never let myself see it before. Never wanted to. It was easier to hate her when I didn't think of her as human. But watching her now, focused, determined, fighting to keep her sister alive, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Celeste wasn't cruel because she enjoyed it. She was cruel because the world she lived in demanded it. Softness got you killed. Kindness was weakness. So she became ice, steel, untouchable. It was survival. And I'd judged her for it. Hated her for it. But standing here, in this tiny cottage in the middle of nowhere, watching her fight for her sister's life, I couldn't find the hate anymore. It was still there, buried somewhere deep, but something else had taken its place. Something I didn't want to name. Celeste handed me a notebook. Check for anything about supply drops. Boats. Anything that suggests people come here. I took it. Our fingers brushed, just for a second. She pulled back like I'd burned her. We kept working. Hours passed. The lantern light flickered. My eyes burned with exhaustion. Celeste finally sat back, rubbing her temples. We're not getting anywhere tonight. I nodded. My body ached. My hands were cramping. That's when I noticed the cold. It had crept in slowly, but now it bit into my skin. My breath came out in small clouds. The temperature had dropped dramatically. We need to stay warm, Celeste said. She looked at the bed, then at me. One bed. 2 blankets. Vivian was already under one. We'll freeze if we don't share body heat, Celeste said. Her voice was flat, matter of fact. But something flickered in her eyes. Just for a second. Heat flooded my face. Share body heat with Celeste? With my boss? With the woman I was starting to see as more than a monster? My mind whirled. My pulse quickened. Celeste was already moving toward the bed. Come on, she said quietly. I didn't move. Couldn't move. Because the thought of lying that close to her, pressed against her in the dark, made something twist in my chest that had nothing to do with fear. Celeste pulled back the blanket, making space beside her on the narrow bed. Vivian lay on the far side, breathing steady now, peaceful. There was barely enough room for 2 people, let alone 3. We don't have all night, Celeste said. Not unkind. Just factual. I forced my legs to move. Climbed onto the bed. The mattress dipped under my weight. Celeste shifted closer to Vivian to make room. I lay down on the edge, careful not to touch either of them. The cold bit into my back immediately. The blanket was thin, the cottage walls useless against the wind. I was shivering within seconds. You're going to freeze like that. Celeste's voice came from the darkness beside me. Before I could respond, her arm wrapped around my waist and pulled me back against her. My breath stopped. Her body was warm. So warm. The heat of her seeped through my damp clothes, chasing away the cold. She pulled me closer, tucking me against her chest, her head coming to rest against my neck. I felt her breath soft, steady, against my skin. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I thought she'd feel it. Relax, Celeste murmured. It's just body heat. Just body heat. But her arms stayed wrapped around me, secure, almost protective. I couldn't relax. Every nerve in my body was on fire. I was hyper-aware of every point of contact, her chest against my back, her legs tangled with mine, her breath warm on my neck. This was my boss. My terrifying, ruthless vampire boss. And I was pressed against her like we were lovers. My face burned. But the exhaustion was stronger than my embarrassment. My eyes grew heavy. The warmth pulled me under. I fell asleep in Celeste's arms. When I woke, sunlight was streaming through the window. And someone was standing over us. I jerked awake, hard in my throat. Vivian. She was standing upright, stretching her arms like she'd just woken from a nap instead of surviving a gunshot wound. Morning, she said calmly. She gestured to the corner, where she'd laid out canned food on the table. I stared. Celeste stirred beside me, her arms still around my waist. She glanced at Vivian, gave a simple nod, then slipped out of bed like nothing unusual had happened. Wash up first, Celeste said. She didn't look at me as she headed for the door. I sat up slowly, still processing. Vivian had been dying last night. Pale. Bleeding. Barely breathing. Now she looked fine. Better than fine. Like she hadn't been shot at all. How are you? We heal fast. Vivian's lips curved into a faint smile. Runs in the family. She said it like it was normal. Like surviving a bullet to the heart was just another Tuesday. I realized then what Celeste had meant. The twins were made of steel. They had to be. In their world, weakness got you killed. So they didn't allow themselves to be weak. Vivian grabbed my wrist, pulling me off the bed. Come on. You smell like blood and seawater. I followed because what else could I do? She led me out of the cottage and down a narrow path through the trees. The forest was thick here, dense, but Vivian moved through it like she knew exactly where she was going. We reached a small clearing. A natural pool fed by a stream. The water was clear, cold, beautiful. Vivian started stripping without hesitation. I froze. What are you waiting for? She glanced over her shoulder, eyebrow raised. My face burned. We need to wash. Unless you want to stay covered in blood? She had a point. I turned away, fingers fumbling with my shirt buttons. My hands were shaking. I didn't know why. When I finally stripped down to my underwear and turned back, Vivian was already in the water. Naked. I tried not to stare. Failed. She was beautiful. Lean muscle. Scars scattered across her ribs and shoulders. The fresh bandage stark white against her skin. You can help me, Vivian said. She gestured to her back. I can't reach. I stepped into the water. It was freezing. I gasped, goosebumps breaking out across my skin. Vivian didn't flinch. I moved closer. Close enough to reach her. My hands trembled as I cupped water and let it run over her shoulders, washing away the dried blood and salt and dirt. Her skin was warm under my fingers. Soft. I was careful around the bandage. Terrified of hurting her. I'm fine, Vivian said quietly. Like she could read my thoughts. I kept washing. My hands moved down her back, her sides. I told myself it was practical. Necessary. But my pulse was racing. Vivian turned. Our eyes met. The air shifted. Heat bloomed between us, fast, sudden, undeniable. I couldn't look away. Couldn't move. Vivian's gaze dropped to my lips. Just for a second. Then she smiled. Small. Dangerous. Your turn, she said. Before I could respond, hands touched my shoulders from behind. I jumped. Celeste. She'd joined us in the water without a sound. Her hands were firm on my shoulders, turning me around. Let me help, Celeste said. Her voice was calm, but there was something in her eyes. Something dark. Hungry. My breath caught. Celeste's hands moved over my shoulders, my neck, washing away the blood and grime with careful precision. But her touch lingered. Her fingers traced the curve of my collarbone, the slope of my shoulder. I shivered. Not from cold. Behind me, Vivian moved closer. I could feel the heat of her body even in the freezing water. I was trapped between them. And I didn't want to move. The tension was suffocating. Intoxicating. The air felt thick, charged. Something had shifted between the three of us. We all knew it. Felt it. The way Celeste's hands moved over my skin. The way Vivian watched with dark, hungry eyes. The way my body responded to both of them. I was supposed to hate them. But right now, all I felt was heat. Then footsteps. Loud. Heavy. Crashing through the trees. We all froze. Celeste's hand clamped over my mouth, pulling me back against her, shielding me. Vivian moved in front of us both. We crouched behind a large rock, water dripping from our skin, barely dressed. My heart hammered. Through the trees, figures emerged. Men. Armed. Scanning the area with cold, practiced eyes. Council soldiers. They'd found us. Celeste's hand tightened over my mouth. Her body pressed against mine, tense and ready. Vivian's eyes were locked on the men, calculating. One of them stopped. tilted his head. Listening. I held my breath. He took a step toward the water. Another step. Vivian's hand found mine beneath the surface. She squeezed once. Hard. Then she leaned close, her lips brushing my ear. Distract him. My heart stopped. What? Before I could think, before I could protest, hands pushed me forward. I stumbled out from behind the rock, water sloshing around my legs. The gunman's head snapped toward me. I stood there, completely exposed. Every inch of my skin bare under the sunlight. For one horrible second, I wanted to run. Hide. Cover myself. But his eyes locked onto me, widened, and his gun lowered. I stepped forward, let him see everything. His focus shifted entirely, hunger replacing caution. He forgot about the forest, the mission, everything. He only saw me. Well, damn, he muttered, taking a step closer. Another. I forced myself to stay still. Not to shake. He was 3 steps away when Celeste struck. She rose from the water behind him, naked and silent, a rock gripped in her hand. The impact was brutal, a wet crack that split the air. He dropped. Vivian was on him instantly, yanking the gun from his hands. She checked the chamber and nodded. Move. Celeste hissed. We scattered just as shouts erupted from the forest. The other gunman had heard. Footsteps pounded toward us. Branches snapped. Voices barked orders. Vivian raised the stolen gun and fired. The sound shattered everything. I hit the ground, hands over my ears, heart slamming against my ribs. More gunfire, closer now. Bullets tore through the trees, splitting bark and sending leaves raining down. Celeste grabbed the second gun from the fallen man and rolled behind a tree. She fired twice. Clean. Precise. Someone screamed. Vivian and Celeste moved like they'd done this 1,000 times. No hesitation. No fear. Just cold, ruthless efficiency. Completely naked. Water and blood dripped down their skin as they fought. They didn't cover themselves. Didn't slow down. They were deadly. Beautiful. Terrifying. I scrambled toward the rocks, trying to stay low, trying not to get shot. A bullet hit the ground inches from my hand. I yelped, threw myself behind a boulder. My whole body shook. My ears rang. I couldn't think. The forest had turned into a war zone. More gunfire. More screaming. Then footsteps. Heavy. Deliberate. Coming toward me. I held my breath as a shadow fell over me. I looked up. A man stood there, gun in one hand, eyes locked on my body. The look on his face made my stomach turn. Well, he said. His smile was all teeth. What do we have here? I tried to move. He was faster. His hand clamped around my wrist and yanked me up, slamming me back against the rock. Pain shot through my spine. I gasped. Don't scream, he said. His breath was hot against my face. Wouldn't want to ruin that pretty face. His other hand grabbed my waist. Rough. Possessive. I shoved at his chest. Get off. He laughed, pressed closer. His body pinned me, trapping me against the stone. Feisty. I like that. His hand slid lower. I twisted, trying to break free, but he was too strong. Panic flooded through me. His grip tightened. His fingers dug into my bare skin, hard enough to bruise. Stop fighting, he growled. I didn't stop. I kicked, scratched, fought with everything I had. It wasn't enough. He slammed me harder against the rock. My head cracked against stone. Stars burst across my vision. Hold still. His hand moved. Groped. Violated. I screamed. His other hand clamped over my mouth, cutting off the sound. Tears burned my eyes. My lungs screamed for air. His hand moved lower. Lower. I bit down on his palm. Hard. He cursed, yanked his hand back. Then his fist connected with my jaw. Pain exploded through my face. Blood filled my mouth. Stupid bitch. His hand closed around my throat. I couldn't breathe. Couldn't scream. Couldn't fight anymore. His other hand groped me, rough and invasive, taking what he wanted. My vision blurred. The edges went dark. I was going to die here. Naked. Alone. Helpless. Then a gunshot. The pressure vanished. The hand on my throat loosened. The man's eyes went wide. Blood bloomed across his chest as he fell. Behind him stood Vivian. Completely naked. Gun raised. Eyes blazing with a fury I'd never seen before. Don't touch her. The man's body hit the ground with a heavy thud. Vivian stood there, naked and bloodied, gun still raised. Her eyes locked on mine. Something broke inside me. I stumbled forward and threw my arms around her. She caught me, held me tight. I sobbed into her shoulder, shaking, gasping, clutching her like she was the only solid thing in the world. Thank you, I choked out. Thank you. Thank you. Vivian's arms tightened around me. One hand came up to cup the back of my head. You're safe, she whispered. I've got you. I couldn't stop crying. The fear. The pain. The violation. It all crashed over me at once. Footsteps approached. I tensed. It's just me. Celeste's voice, soft. I felt her arms wrap around both of us. Warm. Steady. Grounding. For a moment, we just stood there. Three naked women covered in blood and water, holding each other in the middle of a battlefield. The gunfire had stopped. The forest was silent except for my ragged breathing. All the men were dead. Celeste pulled back first. Her hand lingered on my shoulder for a second before she stepped away. We need to leave, she said gently. Now. More could be coming. Vivian nodded, but didn't let go of me immediately. Her hand brushed my cheek, wiping away tears. Can you walk? I nodded. I had to. We found our clothes scattered near the water. Damp. Torn. But better than nothing. I pulled mine on with shaking hands. Every movement hurt. My throat. My jaw. My wrists. The bruises were already forming. Celeste led us through the trees, moving fast but checking behind us constantly. Vivian stayed close to me, hand occasionally touching my back, steadying me. We found the boat hidden in a small cove. Military-grade communication equipment inside. They came prepared, Celeste muttered. She started checking the supplies. Weapons. Food. Water. Medical kit. Vivian grabbed the communication device, turned it on. The screen lit up with a strong signal. She tried our base frequency. Static. She tried again. Nothing. They're not responding, Vivian said quietly. Celeste took the device, tried different frequencies, different codes. Still nothing. Maybe they're blocking signals, I offered. My voice came out hoarse. Raw. Vivian and Celeste exchanged a look. Something dark passed between them, but they didn't say anything. We sat in the boat, waiting, listening. The forest was too quiet. I pulled my knees to my chest, wrapped my arms around them, tried to make myself small. The shame was suffocating. I'd spent years surrounded by violence and danger, and when it mattered, I couldn't even defend myself. I was useless. Weak. A burden. Genevieve. I looked up. Vivian had moved closer. She sat beside me, her shoulder touching mine. What are you thinking? She asked softly. I shook my head. Couldn't say it. Tell me. I'm useless. The words tasted bitter. I couldn't fight back. Couldn't protect myself. My voice broke. I froze. You survived, Vivian said firmly. That's what matters. I didn't survive. You saved me. Tears burned my eyes again. I'm supposed to work for you. Be useful. But I can't even stop. Vivian's hand found mine. Squeezed. You were brave. You distracted that gunman when I asked. You didn't hesitate. That's different. Is it? Vivian turned to face me fully. You were naked. Terrified. And you still did it. That's not weakness, Genevieve. That's courage. I wanted to believe her. But the shame was too heavy. I'm not like you, I said quietly. Like Celeste. You fight. You survive. You don't need anyone. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then she lifted my chin, forcing me to look at her. I need people, she said. Her voice was soft. Vulnerable. I need my sister. And right now, her thumb brushed my cheek. I need you safe. My breath caught. The look in her eyes was different. Softer. Open. She leaned closer. I should have pulled away. Should have remembered she was my boss. The woman who'd turned me against my will. The monster I'd spent years hating. But I didn't. Our lips met. Soft at first. Tentative. Like she was asking permission. I gave it. The kiss deepened. Her hand cupped my face. Mine found her waist. For the first time since the attack, the fear faded. The shame quieted. There was just her. Just this. When we finally pulled apart, I was breathing hard. My face was hot. Vivian's forehead rested against mine. You're not useless, she whispered. Never think that. I nodded. Unable to speak. Movement caught my eye. Celeste was watching us from across the boat. Her expression was calm. Understanding. Something warm flickered in her eyes. She didn't look upset. Or jealous. Just comforting. When we get back, Celeste said quietly, we'll train you properly. I blinked. What? No more just paperwork, Vivian added. She pulled back slightly but kept hold of my hand. We'll teach you to fight. To defend yourself. To survive. You mean? You're part of this now, Celeste said. Whether you plan to be or not. So we're going to make sure you can handle it. Something warm bloomed in my chest. Hope. Belonging. Thank you, I whispered. Vivian smiled. Small. But real. Then Celeste's expression shifted. The warmth drained from her face. What is it? Vivian asked. Celeste stared at the communication device in her hand. Silent. Calculating. Our base hasn't responded, she said slowly. But these men found us easily. The implication hung in the air. My stomach dropped. You think? I think something's wrong. Celeste's jaw tightened. These men had our location. Had equipment. Had backup plans. They were organized. Too organized, Vivian said quietly. Celeste's fingers tightened around the device. What if our base has already been raided? Silence. The possibility settled over us like ice water. Our women, I whispered. The workers. I don't know. Celeste's voice was tight. Controlled. But I heard the fear underneath. She tried the communication device again. Different frequency. Emergency channel. Static. Nothing. She stared at the screen. Her hands were steady, but her eyes were dark with worry. Something's wrong, she said finally. Her voice was barely above a whisper. We might not have a home to go back to. The words echoed in the silence. Celeste started the boat without another word. The journey back felt endless. None of us spoke. The only sounds were the engine and the waves slapping against the hull. I watched the shore approach, dreading what we'd find. When the base came into view, my stomach dropped. The building was wrecked. Windows shattered. Doors hanging off their hinges. Scorch marks blackened the walls. We docked in silence. The moment we stepped onto land, I saw them. Women. Our women. Huddled near the entrance. Bruised. Bloodied. Clothes torn. When they saw Vivian and Celeste, they dropped to their knees. Forgive us, one of them sobbed. We tried to hold them off. We tried. Get up. Celeste's voice was firm. But gentle. They didn't move. Just kept their heads bowed. Shaking. Vivian walked forward and pulled the closest woman to her feet. Then another. And another. You're alive, Vivian said quietly. That's what matters. I felt something crack in my chest, watching them. These were fighters. Killers. Women who'd survived in a world that wanted them dead. And they'd been reduced to this. Begging for forgiveness. For surviving. How many? Celeste asked. 8, the woman whispered. Out of 32. 8, the number hit me like a physical blow. 24 women were gone. Dead or taken. Celeste's jaw tightened, but her voice stayed calm. Where are the others? Safe house. We sent them there when the woman's voice broke. We couldn't hold the base. You did what you could. Celeste said. That's enough. But it wasn't. We all knew it. I followed Vivian and Celeste inside. The damage was worse than I'd thought. Furniture overturned. Blood on the floors. Bullet holes in the walls. And then I saw it. Spray painted across the main wall in blood red. An emblem. A serpent coiled around a dagger. I recognized it immediately. The same symbol I'd seen on the yacht. On the gunmen's uniforms. It's them, Vivian said quietly. Her voice was ice. Celeste stared at the emblem, her hands curled into fists. They wanted us to know. Wanted us to see what they did. The fury radiating off both of them was terrifying. Controlled. Cold. This wasn't just business anymore. This was war. Celeste turned to the women. Go to the safe house. All of you. Stay there until we come back. Where are you going? One of them asked. To finish this. The finality in her voice sent chills down my spine. The women left without argument. They knew better than to question Celeste. When they were gone, Vivian turned to her sister. Just us, then. Celeste nodded. Just us. My blood ran cold. What are you talking about? We're going to their base, Celeste said calmly. Like she was discussing dinner plans. We're going to end this. The two of you? Alone? Yes. I stared at them, waiting for the punchline. It didn't come. That's suicide, I said. My voice was too loud. Too sharp. You'll be walking into their territory with no backup. No plan. They'll kill you. Maybe, Vivian said. But we're not going to sit here and wait for them to finish what they started. So you're just going to throw your lives away? We're going to fight. Celeste's eyes met mine. It's what we do. No. The word came out broken. Desperate. You can't, Celeste, you can't. Tears burned my eyes. I won't let you. Celeste's expression softened. Just slightly. This isn't your fight. Yes, it is. My voice cracked. You made it my fight when you saved me. When I couldn't finish. Couldn't say it. When you kissed me. When you made me care. You'll stay here, Celeste said. Gentle but firm. With the others. Where it's safe. Safe? I laughed. It sounded hysterical. They raided this place. Killed our people. Nowhere is safe. The safe house is. I don't care about the safe house. I was shouting now. I care about you. Both of you. The words hung in the air. Vivian's expression shifted. Something vulnerable flickered across her face. Celeste looked away. I can help, I said. My voice shook. Let me help. You're not trained. Then train me. You promised you would. There's no time. Then let me do this differently. The idea formed even as I spoke. Desperate. Reckless. Let me infiltrate them. Silence. What? Vivian's voice was sharp. I'll go in as a defector. Or a captive. Whatever works. The words tumbled out faster. I'll get inside. Signal you when I'm in position. Then you come in and we take them down together. Absolutely not, Celeste said. It could work. Asterisk no asterisk. You need someone on the inside. Not you. Celeste's voice was steel. Asterisk never asterisk you. Why not? Tears streamed down my face now. Because I'm weak? Because I can't fight? I know that. But I can do this. I can. You'll be killed. Vivian's voice was quiet. The second they realize who you are. What you mean to us. What you mean to us. The words made my heart stutter. I don't care, I whispered. I can't just watch you walk into that place alone. I can't. My voice broke completely. Please let me help. Let me do something. Celeste stepped closer. Her hand touched my cheek, wiping away tears. For a moment, I thought she'd say yes. Then her expression hardened. "You're not doing this, Genevieve." Her voice was cold. "Final. And that's not a request." I flinched like she'd slapped me. "You don't get to decide that." "Yes," Celeste said quietly. "I do." The distance between us suddenly felt insurmountable. Like a wall had slammed down. "You said I was part of this," I whispered. "You said I was wrong." The words cut deeper than any blade. Vivian looked between us, pain etched across her face, but she didn't contradict her sister. "Stay here," Celeste said. "Keep the others safe. That's how you help." Then she turned and walked away. Vivian hesitated. Her hand reached for mine. Squeezed once. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Then she followed her sister. I stood there alone. Tears streaming down my face. Watching them leave. Watching them walk toward their deaths. And there was nothing I could do to stop them. I didn't stay. The second they disappeared from view, I wiped my tears and ran. Back to my apartment. Heart pounding. Mind racing. I wasn't going to sit in some safe house while they walked into a death trap. I grabbed the files I'd kept at home. Intelligence reports. Territory maps. Information I'd compiled over 3 years of working in the shadows. I spread them across my kitchen table, searching for anything useful. And then I found it. The council leader's known habits. Weaknesses. He frequented a private club in his territory. Every Friday night. Had a thing for the performers. I checked my phone. Friday. My stomach twisted. I was just an assistant. Always in the background. Invisible. The council wouldn't recognize my face. I'd been turned after their last major confrontation, and I'd never been important enough to warrant surveillance. But they'd recognize a willing body. If I played this right. The club was deep in enemy territory. Neon lights. Bass thumping through the walls. Men in expensive suits smoking outside. I walked past them. Head high. Hips swaying. They looked. Of course they did. Inside, the manager took one look at me and nodded. "You dance?" He didn't ask for experience. Didn't ask my name. Just pointed to the dressing room. "You're on in 5. I changed into what the other dancers wore. Black lace that barely covered anything. Fishnet stockings. Heels so high I could barely walk. My hands trembled as I adjusted the straps. The mirror showed someone I didn't recognize. Someone dangerous. Desirable. Good. The music started. Low. Seductive. Dangerous. I stepped onto the stage. The lights blinded me at first, then my eyes adjusted. Men everywhere. Watching. Hungry. I moved. Let the music take over. Let my body do what my mind couldn't process. I'd never danced like this before. Never been looked at like this. But I needed their attention. Needed to be noticed. The council leader sat in the back. VIP section. Surrounded by guards. I made sure he saw me. Rolled my hips. Arched my back. Let my hair fall across my shoulders. His eyes locked onto me. He leaned forward, said something to the man beside him. A guard approached the stage, gestured for me to come down. "Boss wants a private dance." My heart slammed against my ribs. I followed him to the VIP section. The council leader was older, ancient, really, centuries of existence etched into his cruel face. Cold eyes raked over my body like I was property. "What's your name, sweetheart?" I smiled. Leaned close enough for him to smell my perfume. "Whatever you want it to be." He laughed. "Crude. Possessive. I like you already. Dance for me." The music shifted. Slower. Heavier. I moved between his legs. Let my hands trail over his shoulders. My hips swayed close enough to tease but not touch. His breathing changed. Got heavier. I turned, pressed my back against his chest. Felt his hands reach for my waist. I allowed it. Hated every second. But I needed him distracted. My phone was tucked into the strap of my outfit. I shifted, angled myself, snapped a photo of his face. He didn't notice. I sent it to Vivian and Celeste. Location attached. Done. Now I just needed to get out. But the council leader grabbed my wrist, pulled me onto his lap. "Stay," he said. His breath reeked of blood and old wine. "Have a drink with me." He poured something dark into a glass. Pushed it toward me. I took it. Pretended to sip. He drank a lot. Within minutes, he was laughing, talking too much. Guards relaxed around him. "You know what I did today?" He leaned close, his hand squeezing my thigh. "I destroyed the only all-female vampire house in this city." My blood ran cold. "Really?" I kept my voice light. Playful. Burned their base. Killed their women. He laughed. "And now I'm taking over all their territories. Their businesses. Everything." His hand slid higher up my thigh. I forced myself not to flinch. "Those two bitches who run it." He took another drink. "Vivian and Celeste. Think they're so tough. But they're just women. Weak. Pathetic." My vision blurred red. "They'll come crawling back soon enough. And when they do," his grin was vicious, "I'll make them beg before I put silver bullets in their heads." Rage ignited in my chest. White hot. Blinding. I saw Vivian's face. The way she'd kissed me. Protected me. I saw Celeste's hands, gentle when they held me, deadly when they fought. I saw the women at the base. Battered. Broken. Begging for forgiveness. This man did that. This man thought he could destroy them because they were women. He let his guard down around women like me because he thought we could do nothing. My hand moved before I could think. A knife sat on the table. Silver. Sharp. Beside a plate of fruit. I grabbed it. Drove it into his neck. The sound was wet. Horrible. His eyes went wide, shocked. Blood poured over my hand. Hot. Thick. He gurgled. Clutched at his throat. I yanked the knife out. He collapsed forward onto the table. The room went silent. Then chaos. Every guard in the room drew their guns. All pointed at me. I stood there, frozen. Knife still in my hand. Blood dripping onto the floor. I'd killed him. The council leader was dead. And I was surrounded. A dozen guns. A dozen men. No escape. I looked down at my hands. Covered in blood. What had I done? The lead guard stepped forward. Gun aimed at my head. Drop the knife. I couldn't move. Couldn't think. This was it. I was going to die here. In a strip club. At least Vivian and Celeste would know I tried. At least I'd taken him down with me. The guard's finger moved to the trigger. I closed my eyes. Then glass shattered. Gunfire erupted. I hit the floor. Through the chaos, I heard a cold, furious, unmistakable voice. Touch her and you're dead. Celeste. Glass exploded inward. Gunfire tore through the club. Men screamed. I stayed on the floor, hands over my head, knife still clutched in my fist. Bodies dropped around me. Guards who'd pointed guns at my head seconds ago now lay bleeding. Through the chaos, I saw them. Vivian and Celeste. Moving like shadows. Like death itself. They fought through the room with brutal efficiency. Every shot found its target. Every movement calculated. The remaining guards ran. Or tried to. None of them made it to the door. Then silence. My ears rang. Smoke hung in the air. The smell of gunpowder and blood was everywhere. Hands grabbed my shoulders. Pulled me up. Celeste. Her eyes scanned my body, searching for wounds. Are you hurt? I shook my head. Couldn't speak. Her hands moved over me anyway. Checking. Making sure. Vivian appeared beside us. Her gaze dropped to the dead council leader, slumped over the table. Then to the knife in my hand. You did this? Her voice was quiet. Odd. I looked down at the blood covering my hands. My arms. The front of my body. He said, my voice cracked. He said he was going to kill you both. That you were weak. That he'd make you beg. I couldn't finish. The adrenaline drained out of me all at once. My legs gave out. Vivian caught me. Held me steady. I didn't mean to, I whispered. I couldn't let him. Breathe, Vivian said softly. Just breathe. But I couldn't. The shaking started. Violent. Uncontrollable. I'd killed someone. Stabbed a knife into his throat and watched him die. You could have died. Celeste's voice was sharp. Angry. You should have stayed at the safe house. I flinched. I couldn't, I said. My voice was barely audible. I couldn't just sit there while you walked into a trap. So you walked into one instead? Celeste's hands curled into fists. Do you have any idea what could have happened? What they would have done to you? I know. No, you don't. Her voice rose. You could have been killed. Tortured. Worse. I had to do something. The words tore out of me. I had to help. By getting yourself killed? By saving you. Silence. We stared at each other. Both breathing hard. Both on the edge of breaking. Vivian stepped between us. Stop. Both of you. But Celeste wasn't done. You don't get to throw your life away, Genevieve. Not for us. Why not? Tears burned my eyes. You were going to throw yours away. Both of you. Walking into their base alone. No backup. No plan. Just, my voice broke. Just ready to die. Celeste looked away. I couldn't lose you, I whispered. Either of you. So I guess we're even. It's not the same, Celeste said. But her voice was softer now. Strained. Isn't it? She didn't answer. Vivian touched my face. Gentle. You scared us. You scared me first. A bitter laugh escaped Celeste. She pressed her hands to her face, took a shaking breath. When she finally looked at me again, the anger was gone. Just exhaustion. And something that looked like fear. I told you to stay, she said quietly. Because I couldn't lose you. Not you too. The confession hung between us. And I couldn't lose either of you, I whispered. So what did you expect me to do? Celeste closed the distance between us. Pulled me into her arms. I collapsed against her. Sobbing. Shaking. Don't ever do that again, she whispered into my hair. Don't ever scare me like that again. Then don't leave me behind. Her arms tightened. Vivian wrapped her arms around both of us. The three of us stood there. Bloody. Broken. Alive. It's over, Vivian said softly. The council leader is dead. The war is over. I nodded against Celeste's shoulder. Too exhausted to speak. We left the club together. Stepped over bodies. Over shattered glass. Outside, the night air was cold. Clean. The council was leaderless. Their territories undefended. The threat eliminated. We'd won. But it didn't feel like victory. Just survival. Back at the base, the women waited. When they saw us, relief flooded their faces. They didn't ask questions. Just helped us inside. Brought water. Bandages. Silence. Rebuilding began the next day. Weeks passed. The base was repaired. New recruits arrived. The house grew stronger. And I trained. Every morning, Vivian taught me to shoot. To fight. To move like they did. Every afternoon, Celeste drilled strategy. Territory management. How to think 3 steps ahead. I was still clumsy. Still slow compared to them. But I was learning. One evening after training, we sat together in Celeste's office. Just the 3 of us. Vivian poured drinks. Celeste studied maps. I watched them both. What? Celeste asked without looking up. A small smile tugged at her lips. Nothing. But I couldn't stop staring. Vivian moved closer, sat beside me. Her hand found mine. You did good today, she said quietly. I missed half the targets. You hit the other half. Vivian's thumb traced circles on my palm. That's progress. Celeste set down her pen, turned to face us. You're not just an assistant anymore, she said. You know that, right? I nodded. You're one of us now. Her eyes held mine. Fully. Completely. Something warm bloomed in my chest. Vivian leaned closer. Her lips brushed my temple. Ours. The words sent heat through me. Celeste stood, crossed the room, sat on my other side. Is that okay? She asked softly. Her hand touched my face. I looked between them. These 2 deadly women who'd saved me. Protected me. Chosen me. Yes, I whispered. Vivian kissed me first. Soft. Sweet. Like she had all the time in the world. Then Celeste. Deeper. Hungrier. Like she'd been holding back too long. When they finally pulled away, I was breathless. Stay with us, Vivian whispered. Always, Celeste added. If you want. I didn't have to think about it. Always. Months later, I stood on the balcony overlooking the city. Our city. Our rebuilt empire. Vivian leaned against the railing beside me. Celeste stood at my other side. You're thinking too loud, Vivian said. I smiled. Just remembering. Remembering what? The yacht. The forest. How much I hated you both. Celeste laughed. And now? I looked at them. Really looked at them. Now I can't imagine my life without you. Vivian's hand found mine. Celeste's arm wrapped around my waist. They'd told me I was brave. I didn't believe them then. But standing here, between the two women who saved me and the empire we'd rebuilt together, maybe I finally did.